Billionaire's son slapped the black waitress, not knowing she was his long-lost sister. What if the person you hurt the most turned out to be the family you'd been searching for your entire life? The fluorescent lights of Murphy's diner cast harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floor as 28-year-old Jasmine wiped down tables with practiced efficiency. Her gentle hands moved with the rhythm of someone who'd found peace in simple work, but her eyes held stories that most customers never bothered to notice. She hummed softly while she worked, a melody her foster mother used to sing during the hardest nights of her childhood. Jasmine had learned long ago that kindness was a choice you made every day, especially when the world forgot to show it back to you. She'd been working double shifts to save enough money to continue her search for the baby brother she'd lost 20 years ago when the foster system split them apart. Tonight, everything would change in ways she could never imagine. The dinner rush was about to bring someone through those doors who would shatter her world completely. Where are you watching from tonight? Jasmine had been working at Murphy's diner for 3 years, and in that time, she'd become the heart of the small establishment. The regulars knew her name, her warm smile, and the way she remembered how everyone liked their coffee. She treated every customer like family, whether they were construction workers stopping by for breakfast or elderly folks who came in just to have someone to talk to. Her boss, Frank Murphy, often said she was the best thing that ever happened to his struggling diner. The evening crowd was typical for a Thursday night, a mix of locals grabbing comfort food and travelers passing through town. Jasmine moved between tables with natural grace, her conversation flowing easily as she took orders and checked on her customers. Despite working long hours, she never lost her genuine warmth. Every tip she earned went into a small tin box she kept hidden in her apartment, money she was saving to hire a private investigator to help find her brother. She'd been only 8 years old when they were separated, but she remembered everything about little Michael, his gap-toothed grin, the way he used to follow her everywhere, and how he cried that last night when they told him he was going to a different family. The social worker had promised they'd see each other again soon, but soon had turned into 20 years of silence. Jasmine had aged out of the foster system at 18 with nothing but a high school diploma, and a heart full of hope that someday she'd find the little boy who used to call her Jazzy. As the clock struck 8, the diner's atmosphere shifted. A sleek black sedan pulled up outside, looking completely out of place among the pickup trucks and modest cars in the parking lot. From behind the wheel stepped a young man in an expensive suit, his movements sharp with impatience. Even from inside, Jasmine could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he checked his phone with irritation before striding toward the entrance. This was clearly someone accustomed to 5-star restaurants, not small-town diners with cracked vinyl booths and handwritten menus. Frank glanced up from behind the counter, raising an eyebrow at their unexpected visitor but saying nothing. Jasmine smoothed her apron and approached the man with her usual friendly smile, ready to make him feel welcome despite his obvious discomfort with the surroundings. The young man barely looked up from his phone as he slid into a corner booth, his expensive watch catching the light as he gestured dismissively. There was something familiar about his profile, something that made Jasmine pause for just a moment before shaking off the strange feeling. She'd learned not to trust those little moments of recognition. After years of hoping to see her brother's face in every crowd, she'd trained herself to be more realistic about such coincidences. But as she walked toward his table, notepad in hand, something deep in her chest began to flutter with an emotion she couldn't name. The man's dark hair fell across his forehead in a way that reminded her of someone, and when he finally looked up to meet her eyes, the world seemed to slow down for just a heartbeat. Those eyes, she'd seen those eyes before, in dreams and memories that felt more like wishes than reality. The man who sat before Jasmine carried himself with the entitled air of someone who'd never been told no in his entire life. His name was Christopher Blackwell, though she didn't know it yet, and he was having the worst day of his 26 years. His father's business empire was facing a hostile takeover, the woman he'd planned to propose to had left him for his best friend, and now his luxury car had broken down in this forgettable town, forcing him to wait in what he considered a pathetic excuse for a restaurant. "Finally," Christopher muttered without looking up from his phone, his voice dripping with irritation. "I need coffee, black, and whatever passes for food in this place. Make it fast, I've got important calls to make." Jasmine's smile never wavered, though she noticed the dismissive tone immediately. She'd dealt with difficult customers before, and she knew that sometimes people acted their worst when they were having their worst days. "Of course, sir. Our coffee's fresh, and I'd recommend the meatloaf special. It's homemade and really comforting on nights like this." "I didn't ask for recommendations," Christopher snapped, finally looking up. "I asked for coffee and food. Can you manage that, or should I find someone more competent?" The words hit Jasmine like a slap, but she maintained her composure with the grace she'd learned from years of difficult situations. Around them, other diners began to notice the tension, their conversations growing quieter as they sensed something unpleasant brewing. Frank Murphy watched from behind the counter, his protective instincts beginning to stir as he observed one of his favorite employees being treated poorly. "I understand you're having a tough evening," Jasmine said softly, her voice carrying no anger despite the sting of his words. "Let me get you that coffee right away, and I'll make sure the kitchen takes good care of your order." Christopher's phone rang before he could respond, and he answered it with barely contained fury. The conversation that followed was loud enough for half the diner to hear. Something about board meetings, stock prices, and family disappointment. As he spoke, his frustration mounted, his voice growing sharper with each passing moment. When the call ended badly, with whoever was on the other end hanging up on him, Christopher's composure finally snapped completely. "This is exactly what I need," he said, his voice rising as Jasmine approached with his coffee. "Stuck in some backwater town, in some disgusting diner, being served by—" The coffee cup slipped from Jasmine's hand as his words hit her, hot liquid splashing across the table and onto Christopher's expensive suit. The accident was genuinely unintentional, born from the shock of his cruel words, but Christopher saw only carelessness and disrespect. What happened next would haunt both of them forever. In his rage and humiliation, Christopher rose from his seat and struck Jasmine across the face with a force that sent her stumbling backward. The sharp crack of the slap echoed through the suddenly silent diner, and Jasmine's hand flew to her stinging cheek as tears sprang to her eyes. The entire restaurant fell into stunned silence, every eye fixed on the scene unfolding before them. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. But what neither Christopher nor Jasmine knew was that this wasn't just a random act of cruelty between strangers. It was the collision of two lives that had been separated by tragedy 20 years ago, about to discover a truth that would change everything. The silence that followed the slap felt eternal. Jasmine stood frozen, her hand pressed against her burning cheek, tears streaming down her face as she tried to process what had just happened. In 28 years of life, through foster homes and difficult jobs, through loneliness and struggle, no one had ever struck her. The physical pain was nothing compared to the humiliation of being treated as less than human in front of people who had come to respect and care about her. Frank Murphy was the first to move, his protective instincts overriding his usual calm demeanor. "Get out," he said quietly, but his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Get out of my diner right now, before I call the police." Christopher stood there, his hands still tingling from the impact, and for the first time in his life, he saw the true consequence of his actions reflected in the faces around him. Every person in that diner was staring at him with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. An elderly man in a corner booth shook his head sadly, while a young mother pulled her children closer, as if Christopher's cruelty might be contagious. "She spilled coffee on $1,000 suit," Christopher said weakly, but even he could hear how pathetic the excuse sounded in the face of what he'd done. "That's not how we treat people," said Mrs. Peterson, a regular customer who had become like a grandmother to Jasmine. Her voice shook with emotion as she stood up from her booth. "That girl has more grace and kindness in her little finger than you have in your whole body." Jasmine wiped her tears and looked directly at Christopher, her voice steady despite her pain. "I'm sorry about your suit," she said quietly. "It was an accident. I would have paid to have it cleaned." Her dignity in that moment, her ability to apologize even after being struck, hit Christopher like a physical blow. He'd expected anger, screaming, threats of lawsuits. Instead, he was faced with genuine grace from someone he'd treated as beneath his notice. For the first time, he truly looked at her face, and something deep in his mind stirred with a recognition he couldn't quite place. He started, but the words died in his throat as Jasmine's manager approached. "You need to leave now," Frank said firmly. Jasmine, honey, sit down. Let me get you some ice for your face. As Christopher gathered his things with shaking hands, his phone buzzed with a text message from his personal assistant. Found more information about your family search. The little girl was named Jasmine, placed with the Sullivan family before aging out at 18. Last known address attached. The words hit him like lightning. He'd been searching for his biological sister for 5 years, ever since learning he was adopted and discovering he had a sibling somewhere in the world. His wealthy adoptive parents had given him everything except the truth about his origins, and only recently had he begun to piece together his past. Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments. Christopher looked up at the young woman now being comforted by people who clearly loved her, and his blood ran cold. The age was right. The timing was right. And those eyes he'd been seeing in old photos and dreams for years, were looking back at him with a mixture of pain and forgiveness that made him want to disappear forever. Christopher's world tilted on its axis as the impossible truth crashed over him like a wave. The woman he'd just struck, this kind, graceful person who'd apologized for his cruelty, was the sister he'd been desperately searching for. The sister whose face he'd traced in childhood photographs, whose memory had driven him to hire private investigators and spend sleepless nights wondering if she was safe, happy, alive. Jasmine, he whispered, and something in his voice made her look up from the ice pack Frank had brought her. How do you know my name? She asked, confusion replacing the pain in her eyes. I haven't introduced myself. Christopher felt as if he couldn't breathe. His expensive suit, his luxury car, his trust fund, none of it mattered now. He was 8 years old again, crying as social workers pulled him away from his big sister, promising him they'd find a family who could take them both. That promise had been a lie, but somehow, impossibly, fate had brought them together in the cruelest possible way. This isn't happening, he murmured, pulling up the photo on his phone. The only picture he had of them together, 2 children in threadbare clothes, smiling despite everything. His hands shook as he showed it to her, and he watched her face transform as recognition dawned. Jasmine's eyes widened, the ice pack falling from her numb fingers as she stared at the photograph. Michael, she breathed, her voice barely audible. But that's impossible. You're rich, Christopher said bitterly. Successful. I was adopted when I was 8 by the Blackwell family. They gave me everything except the one thing I really wanted, the chance to find you again. The diner had gone completely quiet, every customer and employee watching this impossible scene unfold. Frank Murphy stood with his mouth open, understanding dawning as he watched his kindest employee and his most difficult customer discover they were family. I've been looking for you for 20 years, Jasmine whispered, tears streaming down her face again, but these were different tears, tears of joy mixed with heartbreak. I saved every penny I could to hire someone to find you. I never stopped believing we'd see each other again. Christopher felt his knees buckle, and he sank into the booth as the full weight of what he'd done hit him. I hit you, he said, his voice breaking. I hit my own sister, the person I've been praying to find, and I didn't even know. The pain in his voice was so raw, so genuine, that even the angry customers began to soften slightly. Mrs. Peterson, still protective of Jasmine, watched carefully as the 2 siblings stared at each other across an impossible divide of wealth, time, and the violence that had just occurred between them. All these years, Christopher continued, I told myself that when I found you, I'd take care of you. I'd make up for all the time we lost, all the birthdays and holidays and moments we should have shared. Instead, He couldn't finish the sentence. Jasmine slid into the booth across from him, her movements careful and deliberate. Up close, she could see the little boy she'd protected and loved, hidden now behind expensive clothes and adult anger, but still there in his eyes. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. Michael, she said softly, using the name that had lived in her heart for 20 years. What happened to you? What happened to the sweet little boy who used to bring me dandelions and tell me they were flowers for a princess? The question hung in the air between them like a bridge across 20 years of separation and pain. Christopher, Michael, looked at his sister's face, still bearing the red mark from his hand, and felt something crack open inside his chest. All the anger that had driven him, all the entitlement and coldness he'd wrapped around himself like armor, began to crumble in the face of her gentle question. "I forgot," he whispered. "I forgot who I was supposed to be. The Blackwells, they loved me, but they taught me that money and power were the only things that mattered. They never told me about you until I was 21, and by then I'd already become someone I don't think you'd recognize." Jasmine reached across the table, her fingertips barely touching his hand. "But you looked for me, anyway. Every day for 5 years," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I hired investigators, followed every lead, checked every database. I had your childhood photo enhanced, aged progression done. I spent more money looking for you than most people see in a lifetime, but I never thought to look in places like this. I was so busy searching the world that I forgot to look in my own backyard." Frank Murphy approached their table quietly, setting down 2 cups of coffee and a piece of Jasmine's favorite pie with 2 forks. "On the house," he said simply, his understanding and forgiveness clear in his gesture. Even Mrs. Peterson had moved closer, her protective stance softening as she watched the siblings slowly find their way back to each other. "I need to make this right," Christopher said, looking around the diner at the faces that had witnessed his cruelty and their miraculous reunion. "All of it. Starting with you." Jasmine studied her brother's face, seeing past the expensive suit and the entitled attitude to the scared, lost little boy underneath. "Making it right doesn't happen in one moment," she said gently. "It happens every day, in how you choose to treat people, in who you decide to be from now on." Christopher nodded, understanding flooding through him. "I want to learn. I want to remember who I used to be before I forgot that kindness matters more than money." He paused, looking directly into her eyes. "Will you help me remember, Jazzy?" The childhood nickname broke something loose in both of their hearts. Jasmine smiled through her tears, the first genuine smile she'd given him all evening. "Only if you promise me something, Michael. Anything. Promise me you'll never forget again that every person you meet is someone's family. Someone's whole world. Promise me you'll treat them the way you'd want someone to treat your sister." Christopher felt tears running down his cheeks as he nodded. "I promise." They sat together in that small diner, surrounded by strangers who had become witnesses to forgiveness and redemption, slowly bridging 20 years of separation with stories and shared memories. Christopher learned that Jasmine had become everything he'd hoped: kind, strong, and full of the same love that had protected him as a child. And Jasmine began to see glimpses of her little brother returning as the evening wore on,